The spoon was already at his lips. Kaylee's moved without thinking. His hand shot across the white linen table, fingers locking around the wrist of the most powerful alpha in Blackmere, and the entire ballroom stopped breathing. Not quieted. Stopped. 400 people. Crystal chandeliers throwing warm gold across the room. A live string quartet. The soft clink of champagne glasses, and then nothing. Pure, suffocating nothing. Kaylee's felt the exact moment every armed man in the room reached for something beneath his jacket. He did not let go. Vedrik Soren looked down at the hand wrapped around his wrist. Slow. Unhurried. Like a man who had all the time in the world and no fear of anything in it. His dark eyes traveled up Kaylee's arm, across his chest, and landed on his face with the weight of something heavy being set down. The room was still not breathing. Kaylee's voice came out smaller than he wanted it to. Don't eat that. Hi viewers, if you were Kaylee's in that moment, would you have grabbed the wrist or walked away? Drop your answer in the comments. I need to know. 3 words. That was all he had. 3 words to explain why a temp catering worker, 23 years old, Omega, dressed in a wrinkled service uniform he'd borrowed from a colleague, had just physically stopped the eldest Soren brother from eating his dinner in front of every dangerous man in the city. Vedrik's expression did not change. That was the terrifying part. Not his size. Not his reputation. Not the 6 armed guards now closing from 3 directions. It was the absolute stillness on his face. Like nothing Kaylee's could do would ever be surprising enough to actually move him. Explain, Vedrik said. 1 word back. Calm as concrete. Kaylee's hands were shaking badly now. He could feel it. He pressed his fingers harder around the man's wrist because letting go felt more dangerous than holding on. The sauce, Kaylee's managed. The reduction. There's something in it. I can smell it. Someone laughed. Short and dismissive. Came from the left side of the table where Riser Soren, the second brother, was leaning back in his chair watching Kaylee's the way a man watches a bug before deciding whether to move it or crush it. You can smell it, Riser repeated. Flat. Like the words themselves were an embarrassment. Bitter almond, Kaylee said. Under the wine base. It's faint, but it's there. The third brother, Noctaire, quieter than both, sitting slightly back from the table, said nothing. He just looked at the bowl. Then at Kaylee's. Then at the bowl again. That look. That was the first crack in the room's confidence. Vedrik set the spoon down. Not quickly. Not with alarm. With the same controlled deliberateness, he did everything else. He placed it on the edge of the bowl and pulled his wrist, gently, from Kaylee's grip. Then he looked at his head of security, and said 3 words of his own. Clear the floor. The staff moved. The guests moved faster. And Kaylee stood alone at the head table in the emptying ballroom with his heart slamming against his ribs and the sudden, terrible understanding that he had just made himself visible in the one city where invisible people survived. What he didn't know yet, what he couldn't have known, was that across the ballroom, standing near the eastern exit in a pale gold suit, the man who had arranged the dinner menu that evening was already walking through the door. And he was not looking back. The guards moved Kaylee's into a side corridor before the last guests had even left the room. Not roughly. That was the strange part. They didn't grab his arms or push him against the wall. They just appeared on either side of him and walked, and the expectation that he would walk with them was so total that his legs simply obeyed. The corridor was narrow, carpeted in deep burgundy. Wall sconces throwing low amber light across dark wood paneling. The kind of hallway that existed to move people without being seen moving them. Kaylee's counted doors. Counted turns. Counted seconds. 38 seconds after leaving the ballroom, A door opened and he was standing in a private anteroom with a round table, 4 chairs, and Vedrik Soren sitting in one of them. Just Vedrik. The guards stayed outside. The door closed. Kaylee stood in the middle of the room and tried to remember how breathing worked. Vedrik looked at him for a long moment without speaking. He had one forearm resting on the table, jacket still perfectly buttoned, dark hair slightly uneven at the temple. The only thing about his appearance that suggested the evening had cost him anything at all. "Sit down," he said. Kaylee sat. "Your name?" "Kaylee's Devon." Vedrik repeated it once. Quietly. Like he was placing it somewhere. "You work for the catering service. Temp contract. Tonight only. And you smelled something in the reduction sauce." "Yes." "Bitter almond." "Yes." Vedrik was quiet for a moment. His eyes moved across Kaylee's face in a way that felt less like looking and more like reading, like he was processing information in layers, and what showed on his face was simply the surface of something much more involved going on underneath. "Why do you know what that smells like?" he asked. Kaylee's had asked himself that question 100 times in the last 10 years. The answer never got easier to say out loud. "My father," he said. "He worked in pharmaceutical processing. We grew up around chemical vocabulary. I know what contaminated compounds smell like up close." That was the version he gave strangers. Shorter. Cleaner. Missing the part about standing in a hospital corridor at 16 while doctors explained what had gone wrong with a medication batch and why it was too late. Vedrik studied him. "The sauce was prepared by the estate's kitchen staff," he said. "The same staff who have worked this property for 11 years. "I know what I smelled," Kaylee said. Something shifted in Vedrik's expression. Barely. Less than a millimeter of change around the eyes. But it was there. He stood. Crossed to the door. Opened it, and said something low to someone outside. Then he came back and sat down. "We'll know within the hour," he said. He did not send Kaylee's away. He did not make small talk either. He pulled the phone from his jacket pocket and worked in silence, and Kaylee sat across from him in a chair that cost more than his monthly rent and stared at a spot on the table between them, and tried not to think about how many different ways this evening could still destroy him. 41 minutes later, Noctaire opened the door. He looked at his brother. One look. That was all. Vedrik stood slowly. "Cyanide-adjacent compound," Noctaire said quietly. "Odorless to most people." Masked inside the reduction. The dosage was measured. Calibrated. He paused. It would have looked like a cardiac event. The room went very still. Vedrik turned his head toward Kaylee's. The expression on his face was still controlled. Still unreadable. But his voice was different when he spoke. "You saved my life," he said. It was not a thank you. It was not warm. It was a statement delivered the way someone states a fact they are still processing, with precision but without performance. Kaylee's didn't know what to say, so he said nothing. Vedrik turned back to Noctaire. "Who prepared the dish?" "Contracted sous chef. Brought in specifically for the gala. His credentials checked out. His references were fabricated." "Where is he now?" Noctaire's jaw tightened slightly. "Gone." The word landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Vedrik straightened the cuff of his jacket. A careful, unhurried motion. "Find him," he said simply. Then he looked at Kaylee's one more time. "You'll be contacted about a permanent position." He moved toward the door. "Do not discuss tonight with anyone." The door opened. And just before he stepped through it, he stopped. Did not turn around. "Devon," he said. "Yes?" "You were shaking the entire time you were talking to me." A pause. "You held on anyway." He left. And Kaylee sat alone in that expensive room for a long time after, heart still going too fast, trying to figure out why that sentence felt more dangerous than anything else that had happened tonight. Because something about the way Vedrik Soren said it didn't sound like an observation. It sounded like the beginning of something. 6 days later, Vedrik Soren stood in front of 60 estate employees and said Kaylee's name out loud in a room full of people who had never once looked at him. That was when everything got worse. The weekly staff briefing happened in the East Conference Hall on the ground floor of the Soren Estate's main building, a wide room with high ceilings, long windows, and the kind of careful silence that forms in spaces where people have learned to be very still around power. Kaylee's was standing near the back wall. He'd taken the permanent position because turning it down hadn't felt like an actual option. He'd shown up that morning in the same borrowed uniform, fixed the collar twice in the elevator mirror, and told himself he would be invisible. He was not invisible. Vedrik stood at the head of the room and spoke for 11 minutes about operational updates, quarterly security reviews, and new protocol for external vendors. His voice was even. His posture was the same as always, the particular stillness of someone who has never once needed to make himself look larger in a room. Then he said, "One member of this staff demonstrated judgment last week that prevented a significant loss. He will be transitioning to a permanent role in estate operations, effective immediately. His instincts are the reason this organization is having a normal Monday." He did not gesture toward Kaylee's. He did not need to. Because every person in that room turned at the same moment, and the direction they all turned was the same. Kaylee's felt 60 pairs of eyes settle on him like 60 small weights pressing from different angles. He kept his face neutral, but his hands at his sides pressed flat against his thighs. What he noticed, what he registered even through the discomfort of 60 stares, was that Vedrik's eyes had not moved with the rest of the room. They had stayed forward. Like he had already known exactly where Kaylee's was standing and didn't need to confirm it. That detail stayed with Kaylee's longer than it should have. The briefing ended. People dispersed. And Kaylee's moved toward the exit with his head down and the very deliberate intention of getting through the rest of the day without another incident. He made it as far as the second corridor. Vedrik fell into step beside him. Not from behind. From a doorway to the left, like he'd been waiting there. Like the exit Kaylee's chose had been anticipated. Kaylee stopped walking. Vedrik did not. "Keep moving," he said quietly. Kaylee's kept moving. They walked for approximately 30 seconds without speaking. The corridor was empty. Their footsteps were the only sound. "You're not eating," Vedrik said. Kaylee's blinked. "Sorry? Lunch. You didn't go to the staff dining room. I wasn't hungry. You also didn't eat breakfast." Kaylee's looked at him. Vedrik was not looking back. He was walking with his eyes forward, jacket perfectly pressed, expression arranged into its usual unreadability. "How do you know that?" Kaylee's asked. Vedrik said nothing. Which was, somehow, an answer. They reached a cross corridor. Vedrik stopped walking, and because Kaylee's was a beat behind in processing everything, he stopped 2 steps later and had to take a small step back to not be standing too far into the other man's space. Vedrik looked at him. "The East Wing kitchen stays open until 9, he said. "There's a standing order for the staff there now." Then he turned and walked the other way. Kaylee stood in the corridor alone, replaying what had just happened, trying to identify the exact moment a simple statement about the cafeteria had started to feel like something else entirely. He looked down. His lunch break badge, a small white card clipped to his collar, had a tiny red corner mark on it. He hadn't put that there. Someone had been tracking his access logs, and had noticed he hadn't gone to eat. That was the moment Kaylee's first felt it, not fear exactly, but something adjacent to fear that had warmth inside it. The feeling of being seen by something that usually saw everything too late. He should have walked away from it. Instead, he turned right and went to the East Wing kitchen. What he didn't notice, because his back was turned, was the man on the upper corridor balcony above the cross corridor. Phone raised. Photograph already taken. The note appeared under his workstation door on a Wednesday morning. No envelope. No signature. Folded once. Ask what happened to the Omega who worked here before you. Kaylee's read it 3 times. Folded it back up. Placed it inside the inner pocket of his jacket, and went to his workstation, and started his morning tasks, and did not allow his expression to change. He was good at that. He had been good at that since he was old enough to understand that certain feelings were safer kept on the inside. By Thursday, the rumors had already started moving through the estate staff the way water moves, finding every low point, filling every available space. He heard his name twice in a hallway before 9 in the morning. Heard it attached to words like calculated and deliberate, and once, from someone who didn't bother lowering his voice. Lucky little Omega who picked the right target. He ate breakfast alone. Sat at the far table in the East Wing kitchen the way he always did, with his back to a wall and a clear line of sight to the door, and he worked through his food quietly and thought about the note. The Omega before him. He'd asked Garen in facilities, carefully, sideways, while discussing something else entirely, whether the estate operations team had turned over recently. Garen had gone quiet in a way that was its own kind of answer. People come and go, he'd said. And then he'd found somewhere else to be. On Friday, Kaylee's found his access level had been quietly upgraded. 3 additional floors. The restricted administrative corridor on level 9. No memo explaining it. No request from him. Just an update waiting in the system when he badged in at 7:45. He stood at the scanner for a moment. Then went upstairs. He made it through most of Friday without incident. Then Riser Soren found him. Not in passing. Not by accident. Riser came around the corner of the level 4 records corridor like he'd been parked there waiting, and he stopped directly in front of Kaylee's with 230 pounds of enforcer energy, and eyes that had the particular flat quality of someone who has decided something before the conversation starts. I'm going to be direct with you, Riser said. His voice was low and even, different from his brother's. Where Vedric's quiet felt like still water, Riser's quiet felt like the pause before weather. Okay, Kaylee said. My brother pays attention to things that matter to him. That's not a habit you want to become part of. I understand. Do you? It was not a question. Kaylee's held his ground. Barely. I'm not trying to become anything. I work here. Riser looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, Deemer from 3rd floor housekeeping has been photographing you. Kaylee's blinked. That's not my concern. That's a management concern. Deemer works for someone outside this estate. That makes it your concern. Riser took one step to the side, not threatening, just repositioning, and looked down the corridor. He's been reassigned to the North Annex as of this morning. If he speaks to you, walk the other way. Then he looked back at Kaylee's with those flat, evaluating eyes. My brother notices things, he said again, including whether the people around him are eating, whether they're sleeping, whether their hands shake less than they did the week before. A pause. I don't know what you are to him yet. But whatever it is, it's already more than he's given most people who've worked here for years. That means people are already watching you. Another pause. Be careful what you touch in this building. He left. Kaylee stood alone in the corridor. His hands were not shaking. They were very still. He reached into his jacket pocket and touched the folded note. Ask what happened to the Omega who worked here before you. He thought about Vedric knowing he'd skipped breakfast. He thought about his access quietly expanding. He thought about someone photographing him from an upper balcony. He thought about Reiser's voice, not threatening exactly, but weighted with something that felt like a warning from someone who actually knew what the threats around here looked like. And he thought about the fact that he hadn't asked anyone the question in the note yet. Not because he was afraid of what someone would tell him. Because he was afraid of what it would mean if the answer pointed somewhere he wasn't ready to look. He walked back to his workstation. When he arrived, there was a small dark blue thermos sitting on the corner of his desk. No note. No name. He picked it up. Opened it. Tea. Still warm. The exact kind, strong, no sugar, small amount of milk, that he'd ordered twice from the East Kitchen in the past week. Someone had remembered. Kaylee set it back down and stared at it for a long time. Because kindness, when it comes from somewhere you can't see and can't fully explain, stops feeling like kindness. It starts feeling like being watched. And he still didn't know which of those things this was. The storm came in off the bay at 6:14 on a Tuesday evening. Kaylee saw it building through the level 9 windows. The sky going the wrong shade of yellow-gray over the Eastern Financial District, the kind of color that meant the transit apps were about to start sending alerts. He finished his documentation work. Logged out. Packed his bag. Took the elevator down. By the time he reached the main entrance, the rain had already begun. Not begun. Arrived. All at once. A wall of it coming down across the Blackmere streets like someone had turned a switch, heavy and cold and indifferent to the 100 or so people now crowding every covered entrance in a 4-block radius trying to figure out how to get home. The transit alert came through at 6:22. All Eastern Corridor routes suspended until further notice due to flooding risk. Kaylee stood under the estate's front entrance canopy and looked at the street and did the math on his situation. The math was not good. He could walk to the Farron Street shelter 2 blocks over and wait it out. He could try to catch a ride app, if any driver in this city was moving in this. He could go back inside and sit in the lobby like someone who had no plan, which he didn't. He was still deciding when the car appeared. Black. Low. Moving through the rain with the particular ease of something built for bad conditions. It pulled to the curb in front of the entrance and stopped, and the rear window descended halfway. Kaylee looked at the car. The car did not explain itself. After approximately 4 seconds, the driver, a quiet man named Cassius who ran Vedrick's personal transport, looked back through the partition and said, "Mr. Devon. Mr. Soren says to get in?" Kaylee got in. The interior was warm. Dark leather. Rain loud on the roof and then immediately muffled as the door closed. The kind of quiet that city cars at a certain price point learn to create. Not silence exactly, but insulation. A curated distance from everything outside. Vedrick was in the back seat. He was not looking at Kaylee. He had a tablet in his hands and was working through something that required most of his attention, and he acknowledged Kaylee's presence only by the slight shift of his shoulder, as Kaylee settled into the seat across from him. The car pulled into traffic. Kaylee looked out the window. The city slid past in amber and silver blurs, streetlights bleeding through rain-covered glass, headlights turning every surface into a smear of light. He watched it, and breathed and told himself not to notice how different the air in this car smelled than the air outside. He noticed anyway. Vedrick turned a page on his tablet. 2 minutes passed without either of them speaking. Then Vedrick said without looking up, "You don't have to look afraid every time I speak to you." Kaylee turned from the window. "I'm not afraid. You tense when I enter a room. Most people who work here do." Vedrick looked up from the tablet. His eyes in the low interior light were darker than usual. Or maybe the same, maybe Kaylee's was just looking closer now, in this smaller space with less room to look away. "I'm not asking about most people. Vedrick said. The words were quiet. Even. Completely without performance. Kaylee's held the eye contact for one breath longer than was comfortable. Someone left me a note, he said. He hadn't planned to say it. It came out the way honest things sometimes do. Before the careful part of the brain catches up. Vedrick's expression didn't change. But his hands went very still on the tablet. What kind of note? He said. It told me to ask what happened to the Omega who worked here before me. The car moved through a flooded intersection. Rain hit the windows from the side. The interior stayed perfectly controlled. Vedrick set the tablet down. For the first time in all the weeks since the gala, Kaylee's watched something shift on Vedrick Soren's face that was not caution, not evaluation, not the particular kind of stillness that powerful men use to keep the room from knowing what they're thinking. What moved across his face was tired. Not performance tired. Not managed tired. The real kind. The kind that lives under everything and only surfaces in small spaces when the work of holding it down gets too heavy for a few seconds. How much do you know? Vedrick said. Not enough, Kaylee said. But enough to know whatever happened to him, it wasn't random. Vedrick looked at him. And enough to know, Kaylee's continued, and his voice was steadier than he expected it to be, that you're not the most dangerous person in your own building. Something passed through Vedrick's eyes. Not surprise. It was past surprise. It was recognition. The specific kind that comes when someone says out loud the thing you've been carrying alone for a long time. He picked up his tablet again. Looked at it. Did not look back at Kaylee's. Don't ask about him where anyone can hear you, he said quietly. Is he alive? Kaylee's asked. A pause. A long one. Yes, Vedrick said. One word. Delivered with the particular weight of someone who had personally made sure of it. The car stopped. Kaylee's looked out the window and realized they were in front of his building. He hadn't told Cassius the address. He was certain of that. He picked up his bag. Opened the door. The rain hit his face immediately, cold and relentless. He stepped out. Turned back. Vedrick was already looking at his tablet again. Or appearing to. Kaylee's looked at his hands. His right hand, resting against the tablet's edge. The knuckles. Bruised along 3 fingers on the right hand, the skin split just at the second joint and beginning to close over. Maybe 12 hours old, maybe less. Vedrick had not been working in his office today. He had been somewhere else. And something had happened there that nobody had mentioned. Kaylee stood in the rain for one more second. Then the window began to rise. And he was left standing on his street in the dark in the downpour, holding his bag, watching the black car pull away into the wet city, with the absolute certainty that whatever was inside that building, whatever had put those marks on that man's hands, whatever had made an Omega disappear from estate records without a trace, it was not finished. And somehow, without choosing it, without ever being asked, Kaylee's was already inside it. The HR file had been touched. Not deleted. Not destroyed. Whoever had done it was smarter than that. They had simply rearranged. Adjusted the timestamps. Moved the termination record to a folder 2 levels deeper than standard protocol, and attached it to an unrelated budget audit from 14 months ago. Kaylee's found it on a Thursday morning at 7:18, 32 minutes before any other member of the administrative team arrived on level 9. He sat with the file open on his screen and looked at it. Zion Ware. That was the name. The Omega who had worked in estate financial documentation for 14 months. The one whose colleague had gone quiet. The one whose badge had simply stopped working one morning without explanation or record. The termination paperwork said, voluntary resignation, personal reasons, effective immediately. No exit interview. No forwarding contact. No severance documentation. Kaylee's had processed enough employment files in 3 weeks to know that even low-level estate staff received exit interviews. It was policy. It had been policy for 11 years. Zion Ware had received nothing. He pulled the budget audit. The file was buried inside. 40 seconds of reading. Then he stopped. The figures didn't match. Not by a small margin. By the kind of margin that only makes sense if someone was moving money somewhere it wasn't supposed to go. And had gotten very good at making the trail look like rounding errors. Kaylee's closed the file. Opened his task log. Typed 3 routine entries that had nothing to do with what he just found. Then he shut his monitor down, picked up his coffee, and walked to the east stairwell like a man who had nothing on his mind. His heart was going very fast. Because here was the thing about those numbers. He recognized the account codes. He had processed expense routing for 2 of them in his first week. They were registered under the names of 3 members of the Soren Estates Founding Advisory Council, the old money alpha patriarchs who had built this organization alongside the brothers' father 20 years ago. And the transfers had started 14 months ago. Exactly when Zion Ware had started working in financial documentation. Exactly when someone had needed him gone. Kaylee stood in the stairwell and pressed one hand against the cold concrete wall and breathed. He thought about what Reiser had said. Be careful what you touch in this building. He thought about the note under his workstation door. He thought about bruised knuckles. He thought about Vedrick saying yes, 1 word, 1 beat of silence, when asked if Zion was still alive. There was someone in this organization moving money. Building something with it. And they had removed 1 Omega already for getting too close. Kaylee's was standing in the same department. In the same role. With the same access. He pushed off the wall. Walked back up the stairs. Sat at his desk. Pulled up a completely unrelated spreadsheet. And in the back of his mind, behind the part doing the routine work, the other part started assembling what he knew into a shape he could use. He needed 1 more piece. He didn't expect to find it by accident. But at 4:47 that same afternoon, he turned a corner in the level 6 corridor and stopped. DeMarco Vale, Vedrick's fiancé, was standing pressed against the wall near the east service exit with his phone to his ear and his eyes closed. His shoulders were shaking. Not rage. Not frustration. The particular shaking of someone trying not to fall apart in a place where falling apart was not an option. His voice, when it came through in fragments as Kaylee stood frozen 6 feet away, was barely above a whisper. I already told you I can't. I know what you said, please. He doesn't know anything. Just leave Tyree out of this. He opened his eyes. Saw Kaylee's. The phone dropped to his side. The composure came back. Fast and practiced and heartbreaking in how automated it was. Like a man who had trained himself to reassemble from the outside and no matter what was collapsing underneath. Mr. Devon, DeMarco said quietly. I didn't hear anything, Kaylee said. It was not entirely true. DeMarco looked at him for a long moment. His jaw was tight. His eyes were red at the edges in a way that foundation almost covered. Good, he said. And he walked away. Kaylee stood in the empty corridor and let the last piece click into place. Tyree. A name. A person being used. DeMarco Vale was not running anything. He was being run. And whoever was holding his leash had a name that Kaylee's was now very close to finding. He thought about Vedrick sitting in that car with tired eyes. He thought about what it cost a man to be surrounded by power and still be the one getting maneuvered. He pulled out his phone and typed 1 message to a number Nakter had quietly given him 12 days ago without explanation or instruction, the way Nakter did everything. With the calm confidence of someone who plans things and waits for the right season. The message said, I need 30 minutes. Not in the building. The reply came in 4 seconds. Tomorrow. 6 a.m. The Farron Street parking structure. Level 3. Kaylee's exhaled. Tomorrow, then? But that night, walking home through streets still wet from the previous week's rain, he passed a parked gray sedan he didn't recognize. It was there when he left. It was still there, same position, same plate angle. When he looked back from half a block away, someone was watching his route home. And they had started tonight. Nocturne was already there when Kaylee's arrived. 6:02 in the morning. Level 3 of the Farron Street structure. One car, black, no plates visible from the elevator, and Nocturne leaning against the hood with his jacket collar up and a coffee in each hand. He held one out when Kaylee's crossed the concrete toward him. Kaylee's took it. "You found the WARE file," Nocturne said. Not a question. "Yes." "The budget audit?" "Yes." Nocturne looked at the wall across from him. A long, considering look. Like he was deciding how much of a door to open and how fast. "How much do you want to know?" he said. "All of it," Kaylee said. Nocturne turned his head. Looked at Kaylee's the way he always did, that slow, layered read, like he was measuring something that had several depths. "All of it is going to change what you can do here," he said. "Where you can go. Who you can talk to. It changes your position in this building in ways that don't reverse." "I know," Kaylee said. A pause. Then Nocturne pushed off the hood and said, "Walk with me." They walked the outer edge of the structure. Concrete open to gray morning sky on one side, rows of parked cars on the other. Their footsteps were the only sound. "The founding council," Nocturne began. 7 men. My father's original partners. They built this organization with him before any of us were old enough to understand what it was. He paused. My father trusted them completely. That was the design. Meaning they built themselves into a position where trust was the only thing that held the structure together. Yes. And when my father died, the trust transferred, but the power didn't. Not cleanly. There were provisions in the estate charter that required unanimous council approval for certain categories of decision. Inheritance transfers. Succession documents. External partnerships. Kaylee's followed the logic. So Vedrick couldn't act without them. Vedrick couldn't consolidate without them. He could run operations. But restructuring the charter, removing their veto power, required their own signatures. And they had no interest in signing away control. So they'd been holding it. For 3 years, Nocturne said. And in those 3 years, they'd been moving money. Slowly. Carefully. Into external accounts registered to Shell Foundations. When Zion found it, he wasn't even looking for it, it came up in a routine audit cross-reference. They had him removed within 72 hours. But Vedrick didn't know until after. By the time I told him, the records had already been adjusted. Nocturne's jaw tightened slightly. Someone on the council has access to estate administrative systems at a level that shouldn't be possible from outside. Someone inside gave it to them. Yes. Kaylee's thought about the gray sedan outside his building. The gala, he said. The poisoning. Nocturne stopped walking. Turned to face Kaylee's directly. The charter restructuring document was scheduled to be signed the week after the gala, he said. If Vedrick had died that night, cardiac event, no apparent cause, Reiser would have assumed leadership. And Reiser does not have Vedrick's interest in reform. The council knows that. The morning air was cold. Kaylee's felt it more now than he had a minute ago. They tried to kill him over a document, he said. They tried to kill him because that document would have ended their control of a $300 million organization. Nocturne looked at him steadily. And DeMarco Vale, they recruited him 8 months ago. His younger brother Tyree has a debt. A serious one. The council bought it, and have been using it as leverage ever since. Kaylee's closed his eyes for 1 second. Opened them. DeMarco didn't want to do it. No. He's been compliant under duress. He didn't know about the poison until after. When he found out, that's when the phone calls from the council started changing in tone. Nocturne paused. He's been trying to protect Tyree without giving them anything real. It's a bad position to be in. This matters. Sit with this for a second. The man everyone in that building had spent weeks quietly resenting. The beautiful, composed fiancé in the perfect suits had been drowning the entire time. Not villain. Hostage. The council knows about me, Kaylee said. Yes. You became a variable they didn't plan for. An Omega with level 9 access, a history with financial documentation and… Nocturne paused carefully. A visible connection to Vedrick that they can't categorize or control. He looked at him. They started surveilling your route home 4 days ago. I noticed last night. Nocturne nodded slowly. They're building a narrative. That you're manipulating Vedrick. That you obtained your position through calculated seduction. They're preparing to take that story to 2 external news sources they'd been maintaining for years. Kaylee's felt the cold go deeper. If they destroy Vedrick's credibility through association with me, the charter signing falls apart. The board loses confidence. The council reasserts control in the resulting vacuum. Nocturne looked at him without flinching. They're not going to come at Vedrick directly again. Too visible after the gala. They're going to come through you. The wind moved through the open side of the structure. Kaylee stood with his coffee going cold in his hand. He thought about Vedrick in a car at night with bruised hands and tired eyes saying yes to a question about whether a young Omega was still alive. Like protecting one person in a building full of threats was the one thing he'd held onto when everything else had been engineered to fall away. He thought about 3 years of isolation. 3 years of having the walls of his own organization quietly closed around him by the men his father had trusted. He thought about what it costs a man to be powerful in every visible way and still be the one being starved of the thing that actually keeps people standing. What do you need from me? Kaylee said. Nocturne looked at him for a long moment. What you already found in that budget audit, he said. Clean documentation. A paper trail they can't explain away. And one more thing. What? DeMarco. He has communications with the council dating back 8 months. He hasn't given them to anyone because he's afraid of what happens to Tyree if he does. Nocturne's voice was even. Someone needs to give him a reason to believe Tyree will be protected before he hands anything over. Kaylee's understood. He won't trust Vedrick, he said. Not yet. No. But he might trust someone who has no power and nothing to gain. Nocturne didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Kaylee's handed the empty coffee cup back. I'll talk to him, he said. He walked back toward the elevator. Behind him, Nocturne said quietly. Kaylee's. He stopped. The council called an emergency session last night. They're moving faster than we expected. A pause. You have maybe 4 days before the story goes to press. 4 days. Kaylee stepped into the elevator. The doors closed. And somewhere across the city, in a council chamber where 7 men had spent 3 years engineering one man's loneliness into a weapon they could point at his empire. One of those men was already reading a draft. Kaylee's found DeMarco in the estate garden at 7:15 the next morning. Not by accident. He had looked at DeMarco's schedule, publicly visible on the shared estate calendar, and seen a single blocked hour between 6:45 and 7:45 listed as personal, no meetings. Every morning. Same time. The garden was behind the main building. Stone paths. Old oak trees that had been there longer than the estate. A fountain that had been turned off for winter and stood dry in the center of the space. DeMarco was sitting on a bench near the far wall with his coat on and his hands in his lap and his eyes on the ground. He looked up when he heard Kaylee's footsteps on the stone. He did not look surprised. "You're early," he said. "I know your schedule," Kaylee said. "Apparently." DeMarco looked back at the ground. "I've been expecting someone to come. I didn't expect it to be you." Kaylee sat down on the bench beside him. Not close. Not distant. Just present. "Tyree," Kaylee said. DeMarco's jaw tightened. "What about him? He's 22. The debt was taken on in a bad year. The council bought it because they had a use for you and they needed a door." Kaylee's looked at the dry fountain. "That's not your fault. That's how those men operate." DeMarco was quiet for a moment. "You've been investigating," he said. "Yes." "Does Vedrick know?" "Noctaire does." DeMarco looked at him sideways. Something moved behind his eyes. "If I give you what I have," he said quietly, "they'll accelerate whatever they're planning for Tyree. They have people watching the facility where Reiser has already moved Tyree," Kaylee said. DeMarco went very still. "When?" "This morning. Before 6. He's in a secured private residence under a different name. The council's watchers will check in at 8 and find an empty room." Kaylee's kept his eyes on the fountain. "Reiser doesn't trust easily. But he trusts Noctaire. And Noctaire told him what needed to happen." The silence stretched for a full 10 seconds. DeMarco pressed both hands flat against his thighs. His voice, when it came, was lower than before. "I didn't know about the poison until after," he said. "I want you to understand that. I know. They told me my role was, they called it relational positioning. They needed someone close to Vedrick who could relay information. That was all it was supposed to be." He exhaled slowly. "And then I found out what they actually used that information for. And by then Tyree was already in the facility." "Yes." Kaylee's finally turned to look at him. DeMarco's face up close, without the composure, without the practiced assembly of a man maintaining a public position. It was just a tired face. A young man who had been carrying something very heavy for 8 months in complete silence. "You've been protecting him," Kaylee said. "That's real. Whatever you had to do it, it cost you something. That's real too." DeMarco looked at him. His eyes were dry. He was past the point where crying was a release. He had gone somewhere beyond that. "What do you need?" he said. "Everything you have. Communications. Meeting records. Any documentation of instruction from the council. Anything they sent you in writing." Kaylee's voice was steady. "We need a clean chain they can't disrupt or claim was fabricated. What you have, 8 months of it, closes the gaps we can't fill from the financial records alone." DeMarco looked at the ground again. A long moment. "There's something else," he said. Kaylee's waited. "One of the council members, Aldous Crane. He's the one who handled me directly. He has a secondary correspondence account. He used it for everything sensitive because it routes through a private server in a different jurisdiction." DeMarco paused. "He made me use it too. So there'd be no record on the estate's internal system. You have access to that account? The login credentials?" "Yes." "I never deleted them." Another pause. He thought I was too afraid to use them against him. Pause on that. He was wrong, Kaylee said. Something shifted in DeMarco's face. Faint. The smallest possible version of relief. The kind that comes not from the problem being solved but from not being alone inside it anymore. "When?" he said. "Today," Kaylee said. "Tonight at the latest. Once the council realizes Tyree is gone, They'll know something shifted. We need to move before they do. DeMarco stood up from the bench. He straightened his coat. Looked at the dry fountain for a moment, that still, empty stone basin in the middle of the winter garden. Then he said without turning around, "He never deserved what they did to him." He wasn't talking about Tyree. Kaylee's looked at DeMarco's back. "No," he said quietly. "He didn't." DeMarco walked back toward the building. And Kaylee sat alone in the garden with the cold air, and the bare trees and the weight of what was about to happen pressing down from every direction. He thought about Vedrick in his office at night reviewing documents. Alone. At a desk built for a man with a full team around him, and mostly just him. He thought about what Noctaire had said. Emotionally starved on purpose. 3 years of that. 3 years of an organization designed around your name, run partially by men engineering your isolation, while you've held the exterior together with both hands and nobody told you the truth. Kaylee stood up. He pulled his phone out. Found the number Vedrick had sent him the previous week, no names saved, just the number, and typed 4 words. "We need to talk." The reply came while he was still standing in the garden. "Office. 1 hour." Kaylee's looked at the message. Looked at the dry fountain. Then walked back toward the building with the absolute understanding that the next conversation he had with Vedrick Soren was going to be the most honest either of them had allowed themselves to be in a very long time. And honesty in a place like this was either the safest thing in the room, or the most dangerous. He didn't know yet which one it would be. The office was empty when Kaylee's arrived. Not for long. Vedrick came through the side door at 7:58 with his jacket already on and his eyes carrying the particular quality of a man who had not slept well and was not going to say so. He looked at Kaylee standing in the center of the room. He looked at the folder in Kaylee's hand. He didn't ask any questions. He crossed to his desk, sat down, and said, "Show me." Kaylee's opened the folder. He laid it out in sections. The budget audit with the mismatched account codes. The Shell Foundation registrations. The timeline mapping when transfers began against when Zion Ware's employment ended. The Crane correspondence account credentials and the partial record DeMarco had pulled from it that morning, 41 messages spanning 8 months. Meeting summaries. Instruction logs. 2 voicemail transcripts where Crane's instructions had been committed to text. And at the back, a single document. A draft article, already written, ready for publication. Soren Air's relationship with Omega staff member raises concerns of manipulation and breach of fiduciary trust. Kaylee's laid it on the desk last. Vedrick looked at it. He was still. Completely still. The way he always was, except that this stillness was different. This was not the controlled stillness of a man choosing his response. This was the stillness of a man processing something that was landing at a depth he hadn't expected. "They'd been building this for how long?" he said. "The article, at least 6 weeks. The operation around it, 3 years. Kaylee's kept his voice even. "The gala was meant to be the end of it. When that didn't work, they shifted to a longer approach. Reputational damage instead of physical removal." Vedrick's eyes moved across the pages. "DeMarco gave you this?" "Yes. Voluntarily. His brother is safe. Reiser moved him this morning." Vedrick looked up. Something passed through his face. Not surprise. Something past surprise. The particular expression of a man who has spent years assuming the worst about situations, and just discovered that 2 people he had not asked for help from had already been working. "You should have told me," he said. "You would have moved too fast," Kaylee said. "They were already watching my movements. If you'd responded before we had the full chain, they'd have pulled the documentation, burned the account, and the article goes out with nothing to counter it." Vedrick held his gaze. "You were protecting the operation," he said. I was protecting you, Kaylee said. Quiet. Very quiet in that office. The city outside the windows moved without sound behind the glass. Vedrick looked at the draft article again. Aldous Crane, he said. The primary operator. 2 other council members co-signed the Foundation registrations. The remaining 4 may have known in broad terms. Noctaire thinks at least 2 of them were kept uninformed, used as cover without full knowledge. Vedrick picked up his phone. Dialed. Said 3 words when the line connected and ended the call in under 10 seconds. Then he set the phone down. Reiser will have Crane's personal offices secured within the hour, he said. His system access to estate infrastructure is being revoked right now. What about the article? The 2 news sources, I know both editors. Personally. His voice was flat. Certain. Neither of them will run something that can be legally challenged at the source document level. When we give them the counter-record, they'll kill it without being asked twice. He stood. He picked up the draft article. Looked at it for a moment, the headline, the framing, the careful language designed to make Kaylee sound like a calculation and Vedrick sound like a fool. Then he set it face down on the desk. I owe you an explanation, he said. Kaylee's blinked. About what happened after the gala. Vedrick moved to the window. Stood with his back partially to the room, looking out at the city. The night you told me in the car about Zion. I wasn't reviewing work on that tablet. He paused. I had been to the West District facility where Zion was being kept. I moved him 3 days after Noctaire told me what had happened to him. Quietly. Under a cover arrangement. He turned his head slightly. The bruises. There was a disagreement with 2 of Crane's men who were on site. A disagreement, Kaylee said. They declined to leave. Kaylee's looked at his hands. The same hands he'd studied in the car window. Split knuckles beginning to close. Why didn't you tell me that night? He said. Because I didn't know yet what you were. Vedrick turned from the window. Looked at him directly. I knew what you'd done at the gala. I knew you were observant. I knew you weren't afraid enough for someone in your position, which meant either you were reckless or you were capable. He paused. I didn't know which. And now? Vedrick looked at the folder on his desk. At everything Kaylee's had spent 3 weeks building quietly in the background while doing his actual job and not asking for credit or protection. No, he said slowly. I know that the person in this organization who has done the most damage to a 3-year conspiracy against me is someone who started here on a $40 temp contract. He said it without irony, without performance. Like it was simply the most accurate sentence he could find. Kaylee's looked at him. Vedrick looked back. The city moved behind the glass. Morning traffic beginning. The day starting its ordinary machinery outside, while in this room something much less ordinary was deciding what shape to take. There's one more thing, Kaylee said. Tell me. Aldous Crane. When Reiser moves on his offices, he'll find the account server physically present. He keeps it local. I know the model because DeMarco described it. Kaylee's reached into the back of the folder and placed one more sheet on the desk. That's the server make, the likely encryption protocol, and the extraction method Noctaire confirmed last night will preserve the chain of custody for a legal proceeding. Vedrick looked at the sheet. Picked it up. Read it. Then he looked at Kaylee's with something that was not quite the unreadable expression he usually wore. It was, almost, the face of a man standing somewhere he hadn't stood in a very long time. Somewhere that felt, for the first time in years, like solid ground. Kaylee's, he said. Yes. You looked at me like I was a person before you decided what kind of alpha I was. The words came out quiet. Measured. With the particular weight of something that had been true for a long time and was only now being given language. Kaylee's held still. I saw what everyone else was choosing not to see, he said. A pause. Long. Then Vedrick said, The council has a formal meeting scheduled for 4 this afternoon. They don't know yet about Tyree. They don't know about DeMarco. They're expecting a standard quarterly session. What happens at 4? Kaylee said. They get the documentation instead of the meeting, Vedrick said. Every transfer record. Every communication from Crane's server. Every co-signature. He straightened. They'll be given 2 options. Resignation effective immediately, with the estate retaining discretion over legal proceedings. Or prosecution through external channels, public, on the record. Which one will they choose? Most of them will choose the first option. A pause. Crane won't? He'll fight it. That's fine. His voice was level. Let him. He picked up his phone again. This time when he dialed, the call lasted longer. Kaylee stood by the window while Vedrick spoke quietly into the phone. Logistics, sequences, names, timelines, the machinery of consequence being set into motion with the same controlled calm he applied to everything. Outside, the city had no idea. Below the building, people were buying coffee and arguing over parking and walking dogs and doing every ordinary thing that the day required. And up here, on the 14th floor, 8 years of careful corruption was about to be handed its own paper trail. Vedrick ended the call. He set the phone down. He looked at Kaylee's. 4 o'clock, he said. I'll be here, Kaylee said. Something moved across Vedrick's face. Faint. Small. The kind of thing that only registers if you've been watching someone long enough to know what their stillness usually looks like and have learned to read the tiny things that move inside it. It wasn't a smile. Not fully. Not yet. But it was close. And that almost smile on a face that had been unreadable since the moment Kaylee's first saw it across a ballroom full of crystal and fear. That was the thing he would think about later. When the council session was over. When the legal team had the documents. When Reiser had walked 3 resigned men out of a conference room and one extremely unwilling 4th man into a different kind of conversation entirely. When the dust of 3 years of careful architecture finally settled. He would think about that small, almost smile. And understand that some things take a long time to become real. But when they do, they are more real than anything you planned. The morning after the council session, Kaylee's arrived at the estate at 6:52. Earlier than anyone else. Quiet building. Security cameras on. Lights on the lower floors still in night mode, warm, low, the kind of light that belongs to early hours and no particular agenda. He badged in. Took the elevator to level 9. Walked the corridor to his workstation. And stopped. The desk was clear. His files stacked exactly as he'd left them the evening before. But there was a cup on the far corner. Dark blue thermos. Still warm when he picked it up. Strong tea. No sugar. Small amount of milk. Exactly right. No note. No name. He stood there for a moment with the thermos in his hand and the quiet building around him, and the city outside just beginning to lighten at the edges where dawn was starting its slow work. He thought about all of it. The gala. The spoon. The ballroom freezing. 38 seconds in a burgundy corridor. A car in the rain. A note under a door. A dry fountain in a winter garden. 41 messages spanning 8 months. A draft article that would never be published. 3 resigned council members and one who had chosen the harder path. Zion Ware, relocated, safe, being contacted through proper channels for the first time in 14 months. Tyree Vale in a secured residence with DeMarco's first real breath in 8 months finally possible. He thought about Vedrick. Standing at a window with the city behind him saying, "You looked at me like I was a person." He thought about how long that sentence had probably been true before it was ever spoken. How long a man can carry something that precise and that painful and find absolutely no one around him who earns the right to hear it. He sat down at his desk, opened his task log, started the morning's work. 4 minutes later, the elevator opened. Footsteps in the corridor. Even. Unhurried. They stopped at his doorway. He didn't look up. "You're early," Vedrick said. "So are you," Kaylee said. A pause. He heard Vedrick cross the room. Heard the chair on the opposite side of the desk being pulled out. Then quiet. The particular quiet of someone choosing to be in a room with no agenda except to be in it. Kaylee's looked up. Vedrick was sitting with a folder open in his hands but not reading it. His eyes were on the window. The light outside was changing. Gray becoming pale gold at the horizon line over the eastern district. He looked rested. Or closer to it than Kaylee's had ever seen him. Like something that had been pressing on him from the inside had found somewhere to put itself down. "The charter amendment goes to legal today," Vedrick said, without looking away from the window. "Formal filing by end of week. The council seats will be restructured. New advisory board, elected rather than inherited." "Good," Kaylee said. DeMarco left last night. His choice. Amicable. A pause. "He took Tyree somewhere quiet for a while." "I think that's right." "I think so too." Another quiet. Comfortable this time. The kind of silence that forms between people who have been through something real together and don't need to narrate it to know it happened. Kaylee's picked up the thermos. "The tea," he said. Vedrick's eyes moved from the window. Found the thermos. "The East Kitchen keeps a record of staff preferences," he said. "Standing order." "I know," Kaylee said. "I found it in the system 3 weeks ago." A beat. "And you didn't say anything," Vedrick said. "I didn't want you to stop." The silence that followed that sentence had a different quality than all the silences before it. Vedrick looked at him. Not the reading look. Not the evaluating look. Not the careful, controlled expression of a man managing his responses in real time. Just looked at him. The way you look at something you've been trying to name for a long time and finally have the word for. "The position," Vedrick said carefully. "Your role here. Going forward, it changes. The scope of it. The responsibilities." He paused. "I'd like you to stay." "I know," Kaylee said. "You know. Noctaire told me yesterday. He's not subtle." Something moved at the corner of Vedrick's mouth. Small. Controlled. But absolutely, undeniably real. The first smile Kaylee's had ever seen on a face he had been reading since the night it looked across a frozen ballroom and asked 4 words in a voice like concrete. "What did you smell?" Kaylee set the thermos back on the desk. Outside, the sun was clearing the horizon now. Gold light coming fully through the east-facing windows. The city was waking up. Traffic beginning. The ordinary machinery of a day starting below without any knowledge of what had ended the evening before or what was quietly beginning this morning. Inside this room, just 2 people. One who had spent years being managed and maneuvered and emotionally stripped down to the frame and was only now, in the careful quiet of an early morning with no witnesses, allowing something honest to take up space. And one who had walked into a ballroom 6 weeks ago with a borrowed uniform and a power bill to pay, and had somehow, without planning it, without asking for it, become the one person in a building full of dangerous men who had chosen to see the one thing everyone else had agreed to pretend wasn't there. That he was human. That he was tired. That he deserved one person who came early, sat down, and stayed. Kaylee's looked at the window. The light kept coming. Quiet. Steady. Unhurried. Like it had always been heading here. Like all of it, every early morning, every folded note, Every cold corridor and rain-soaked night and folder of documents laid on a desk by hands that were still learning not to shake had been pointing at this exact room. This exact light. This exact stillness. That finally, for the first time since he'd walked into the Blackmere founding gala with $40 on his mind and no idea what was about to change, felt like somewhere he was allowed to be. If you made it to the end of this story, you already know, this wasn't just about poison or power or politics. It was about what happens when one person refuses to look away. When one Omega, invisible by design, decides that the truth is worth holding on to, even when his hands are shaking. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something real, drop a comment below and tell me which moment hit hardest. Was it the ballroom? The car in the rain? Or the morning after, when everything was quiet and a cup of tea said what words couldn't? Your voice in the comments keeps stories like this alive.